Welcome to the Jayda InStitches show. Here we are. It's the first Friday in December, which means it's time for the next and last installment in our 2020 Patchwork Calendar Blanket. This month we're going to make the offset square. I love this square because it's got a nice bright highlighter that runs right through the middle, and I really wanted to show off that middle stripe, so I made it a different color, which is kind of neat because I have one other square in this year's calendar blanket of the pink and blue version I did that's got that bright pink in it. So I'm just working in a little bit of extra pink just at the end of the year. Of course, Mr. InStitches is going to put a few more color charts here if you're looking for some additional color inspiration. I'm still deciding on the final multicolored square I'm going to do using this pattern this year. So if you've got any suggestions based on the other colored squares I did this year, leave them in the comment section down below. So let's grab our hooks, grab our yarn, we'll head on over to the craft table, and we will stitch up the final block in our Patchwork Square 2020 calendar blanket together. In order to make our offset square, you're going to want to use the same yarn you've been using all along. For me, that's a medium size 4 acrylic yarn. Today's square has 5 different patches in it. Your middle patch, or that stripe across the center, uses around 9 yards. The 2 smaller squares, or patches, use around 11 yards, and the 2 larger squares use about 22 yards. Remember, you've got a border, that's 9 or 10 yards too. I've been using white for all of my squares all along. You're also going to want a pair of scissors, a yarn needle, and the hook we're using is the same one. 5.5 millimeter, also known as an I or a 9 in the US, a 5 in the old UK terms. And once you've got all that together, we can get started. If you really enjoy our show and you have a lot of fun with us here, then consider supporting us. You can subscribe, click the like button, share our videos with your friends, or you can purchase a pattern at our Etsy shop, or join and become a channel member. You'll find more information in the description box down below, links to our Etsy shop, and also how to join, and there's more information if you click that join button below this browser. As always, I highly recommend that you draw yourself a graph and color it in the way that you want your square to look. This is a 5-patch square, so you can start by drawing a square, putting a belt across the center, and then drawing about 1/3 of the way in up top, one square, and then about 1/3 of the way in on the bottom, your other patch. So you've got 2 small squares, 2 large rectangles, and a belt right down the middle. We're going to begin in the middle with patch number 3, or that nice highlight stripe that runs right through the center of the block. So whatever your patch number 3 color is, you're going to grab that. We're going to begin with a slip knot. And we're going to chain 38 chains to begin. Once you've chained 38 chains, make sure you've got 38, we're going to use the double crochet stitch. We're going to skip the first 3 chains from the hook, find the 4th, and double crochet into it. So those turning chains count as a double crochet stitch. Your first double crochet stitch is worked into the 4th chain from the hook, but we're going to count that as a stitch. Double crochet in each chain all the way across, and you'll have 36 stitches at the end of row 1. At the end of row 1 of patch number 3, so that middle stripe is where we're starting, you should have 36 stitches. We're going to chain 2, and the chain 2 at the beginning of every row for this pattern always counts as a double crochet stitch. Turn our work, and because that chain 2 counts as a double crochet, this first stitch here is already accounted for. So that chain 2 counts as a double crochet stitch. Picture it coming right out of that stitch there. Instead, you work a double crochet into the next stitch, and you can see you've got 1, 2 stitches now already. Double crochet in each stitch all the way across, and you'll still have 36 stitches at the end of row 2. In most cases, the last stitch of a row is worked into the top of the turning chains. So as you're counting along, make sure that you don't miss the top of the turning chains. Because we're treating them as a stitch, you have to remember to double crochet into the top of them when you get there. So that'll be 36 stitches for both rows. That's patch number 3, the middle stripe of our square, and that's it. It's 2 rows long, 36 stitches in each row. You can fasten off. You can work over your tails or weave them in, or just leave them all out to the end and weave them in later. It's entirely up to you. I'll be working over top of my tails. Take your stripe, turn it, and now we're going to begin with stripe, or I should say patch number 2. So our patches are 1, 2, 3, we just did, 4 and 5. So patch number 2, this big top right one, is the one we're going to move to next. You're going to take patch number 2's color and make a slip knot. And we're going to join our yarn with a slip stitch in the top of the last stitch of the last row of patch number 3, that middle stripe that we've started with. Chain 2 counts as a double crochet, and you can clearly see that now because it is coming directly out of that stitch where we joined our yarn. You're going to double crochet into each of the next 23 stitches. So double crochet into each of the next 23 stitches. That will leave 12 stitches unused, and I'll catch up with you when we get there. We joined our new yarn for patch number 2 with a slip stitch and chained 2, and that counts as a double crochet. Double crocheted into the next 23 stitches, and that leaves 12 stitches unused on that middle stripe. We're going to chain 2 and turn, and we're going to double crochet into each stitch. Remember, you always skip that first one because the chain 2 counts. Double crochet in each stitch across, double crochet in the top of the chain 2. Those turning chains count as a stitch, so don't forget to work into the top of them. And you're going to double crochet in each stitch, back and forth, chain 2, turn at the end of every row until you have 8 rows for patch number 2. So 8 rows in total. Each row will be 24 stitches long, I should say, and each row starts with the chain 2. Don't forget to count it as a stitch when you're counting, and don't forget to work into the top of it when you get back to it at the end of the next row. That's 8 rows, 24 stitches across for patch number 2. So we've just completed that middle patch, and now patch number 2. You can fasten off. And turn your work. So now we're looking at it the right side again. We're going to move to patch number 1 now, and we're going to use one of those techniques that we've been using all year long where we continue to work back and forth across the top of, so we're anchoring it to patch number 3, the middle patch, and at the end of every other row we're going to be anchoring it to the side of patch number 2. It's a real simple little slip stitch technique. I'm going to show you that again in case you've never made any of these squares before. And if you find that the slip stitch technique is just a little bit too troubling for you, or you've done some of these squares before and you don't like joining as you go, you can just work the whole square back and forth. This will be 12 stitches by 8 rows. Leave a tail at the end and just sew up the seam between the 2 patches. So there's a couple ways you can do that, but I'm going to demonstrate the no sew version. So we're going to take our patch number 1 color, start with a slip knot on our hook, pick up our square, and we're going to join our yarn with a slip stitch in the next unworked stitch next to patch number 2 there. We're going to join with a slip stitch. There we go. Chain 2. And before we leave, we're going to slip stitch into the edge. So right at the top of row 1 there, just move your hook backwards and slip stitch right through the edge of it. So nothing fancy, nothing difficult, just slip your hook in backwards and slip stitch. And try not to drop your hook like I did. Still going in the same direction, you're going to double crochet in each stitch all the way across now, and that of course will include the top of the chain 2 when you get there. Let me get a couple of stitches in and I'll show you what that looks like. So I'm just working over top of my tails as I go. I find that's kind of neat and tidy. And there we go. Join with a slip stitch, chain 2, slip stitch into the edge of row number 1 of patch number 2. Don't worry, as you work it might feel or look a little cumbersome, but it'll all look very neat and tidy when we're finished. And that is like so much in crochet. Sometimes it can look a little funny in the process of, but once it's all done, it looks great. The last stitch of row 1 for patch number 1 is worked into the top of the turning chains, so don't miss it. You'll have 12 stitches in total for that first row, and that of course includes that chain 2 that began. Chain 2 turn, just like every other patch. Double crochet into the next stitch, so always skip that first one. Double crochet all the way back, and I'll hook up with you when we get back to the side of patch number 2. So the seam between patch 1 and patch 2. When you get all the way back across a row and you arrive back at the seam, don't forget to work your last or 12th double crochet stitch in the top of the chain 2. So there might be a little bit of extra yarn there to work over top of, but it's no different than any other stitch at the end of the row. So top of the chain 2, and then you want to find the top of the row of patch number 1, or 2 I should say, next to it, and you're going to join with a slip stitch to the top of that row. So just lean across and slip stitch. It'll look like that. So you're anchoring the row next to the patch right next door. Turn your work. Get your hook on the front now of your square. And we're going to chain 2. So that's the beginning of row number 3, chain 2, but before you leave, you want to anchor it. So anytime you're working a stitch right next to that patch, you want to anchor it. You want to anchor the chain 2 before you work the rest of the row, and then when you double crochet on the way back into the top of the chain 2 at the end of the row, you want to anchor it before you turn. So you want to make sure the top of every row is anchored. Then you want to make sure that you skip that first stitch. So it's going to look a little offset, a little off kilter, but that's the first stitch which technically your chain 2 has already used. Like I said, it'll look a little funny at first, but don't be discouraged. It always works out in the end. So continue to skip that first stitch, double crochet into the next stitch, double crochet into each stitch all the way across. Make sure you anchor the top of each row to the adjacent square, and you should still have 12 stitches in every row. So 8 rows of patch number 1, the little patches. All the big and little patches are both 8 rows. The little patches are 12 stitches across, and the big patches are 24 stitches across. When you get to the end of a regular row, don't forget to double crochet into the top of the chain 2. So that's my 11th stitch. Number 12 gets worked into the top of the chain 2. There we go. I chain 2, I turn, I'm going to work all the way back across, and when I get back here, I'm going to double crochet into the top of the chain 2, this little guy that sits right up against that patch, and I'm going to join. So I'm going to show you that one more time. Let's crochet all the way back across, and I'll catch up with you at the end of row 4. That's the first 11 stitches of row number 4. Remember, my chain 2 counts. I'm all the way back. I need to work stitch number 12 into the top of that chain 2. So you'll find it resting right up against the side of that other patch we made. Just slip your hook right through the top of it, double crochet, and before you turn, you want to anchor your stitch to the top of that adjacent row. Just jam your hook in there, slip stitch, and then flip your work. Sometimes it helps to lay everything down. Make sure your yarn and your hook are on the same side, so the front side. Chain 2. Chain 2 starts that row. Before you leave, find the top of the row next to it. Keep your yarn on your hook. There we go. Just slip your hook right through the stitch next to you. Join with a slip stitch. And now you've attached row number 5 along row number 5 of the adjacent patch, and off you go. Remember, that first stitch is already accounted for. Even though it's all the way over here, this chain 2 is using it. So you want to jump to the next stitch and double crochet as usual all the way across. And like I said, it can look a little funny while it's being created, but once it's all done, that is a very neat and tidy seam. There's no sewing required, and it's going to completely blend together all the way across. So that's all you have to do. Just work your way, double crochet in every stitch. Remember the top of the chain 2s. Remember that the top of the chain 2 that butts up against the adjacent square is going to be very sort of squished up against the side of it, so don't miss it. And join the top of every row. So if you chain 2 to begin a row, join to the adjacent block before you continue double crocheting. If you double crochet all the way across and you work your last stitch in the top of the chain 2, join to the adjacent patch before you turn to start the next row. And you're going to repeat that for 8 rows in total, and I'll catch up with you at the end of row 8. I'm just finishing row 8 of my small patch. So stitch number 12 gets worked into the top of that chain 2, so just squish your hook in there, anywhere it'll fit. And to join the top of our last row to the top of row 8 of the adjacent patch, we're going to be working into the top of a chain 2. So you can slip your hook right through the top of that chain 2. Make sure you're getting through it and not around it. There we go. And slip stitch. That is it. Little patch, or patch number 1, is attached to big patch, patch number 2, and both of them are worked across the middle patch, which is patch number 3. So that is it for the top 2 patches. Snip your yarn, fasten off. Again, you can weave in your tails now or later, or you can work over top of them as you work your border around it. Now you're going to flip your work and turn it so that now you're looking at the bottom foundation edge of patch number 3, and you're going to repeat exactly the same thing across the bottom of that middle patch. So it's helpful to leave your tails out sometimes because you know that that's where you need to start. And we're going to begin with a big patch. So we've done middle patch, so that's 3, 2, and 1. Now we're turning it over, and as you can see, patch 4 and 5 are exactly the same as these two here. So you're going to start with patch number 4 color. And this works exactly the same way as the 2 patches on the opposite side. You join your yarn with a slip knot. In this case, it's on the bottom of the first stitch of our middle patch. Chain 2. Chain 2 counts as a double crochet. You're going to work a double crochet into the bottom of each of those next 23 stitches, because just like the other large patch, this patch is going to be 24 stitches across by 8 rows high, and the chain 2 at the beginning of every row counts as a double crochet. So you're going to work the first 24 stitches, so chain 2, 23 stitches later, chain 2, turn, and you're going to work 8 rows exactly like we did with this one here. I've just finished patch number 4. I fastened off, and that's 8 rows of 24 stitches each, chain 2, turn at the end of every row. It's exactly the same as the first large patch we did. And now we're going to continue exactly like we did on the other side. We're going to join the color of our second small patch, or patch number 5. We're going to join with a slip stitch in the next unworked bottom of a stitch. So this is a foundation chain, or the underside of a stitch from row 1 of patch number 3. So slip stitch to join, chain 2 counts as a double crochet, and before we leave, we want to join our stitch with a slip stitch to the edge of our first patch. So just like that. Then you can continue. So you're going to double crochet in the bottom of each of those remaining 11 stitches. You'll have 12 stitches, including your chain 2, at the end of the row. And then chain 2, turn, double crochet all the way back, double crochet into the top of that chain 2, which will be sitting squished up against the side of that first patch. Join the row to the adjacent patch with a slip stitch, chain 2, join the row to begin with a slip stitch to the adjacent patch, and then continue double crochet. So you're basically doing exactly what you did on the other side, but over here instead. So 2 small patches, 2 large patches, 1 in the middle, and no sewing required. That's the end of row 8 for my second small patch, or patch number 5. I finished my last double crochet in the top of that chain 2 that's snug up against the other patch, and I joined with a slip stitch to the top of the chain 2 that was at the end of patch number 4 over here. So that's both my patches done on the other side now of my square. 5 patches in total. You can take a moment and weave in all your tails, or you can work over top of them as we make the border. So you want to turn your block over so that it looks like your little sketch that we did. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 patches. You can take your border color. I'm using white. We're going to start with a slip knot on our hook and pick up your square right side facing. You're going to join with a slip stitch in the top of that last stitch of patch number 2. So we're looking at the top of the square or the bottom. It doesn't matter. It's going to be the same. You just want to make sure that the right side of the square is facing you. So we're joining with a slip stitch, chaining 2 to begin in that first stitch there. And now you're going to double crochet in each stitch across. There'll be 36 stitches at the end of this first side, and that includes the little chain 2 that you began with. At the end of the first side of your border row, you should have 36 double crochet all the way across. Remember, that includes the chain 2. And speaking of chain 2s, you will be working a double crochet into the top of a chain 2. So you know there's at least 1 in the middle of your square as you work all the way across. But make sure you've got 36 stitches. That's what's most important. When you get to the end of a row or a side, you're going to chain 2. That counts as a little corner, so it helps us turn the corner. And you're going to double crochet into the same place that you worked the last double crochet of that last side. So double crochet, chain 2, double crochet in each little corner stitch all the way around. That's helpful. So when you get to a corner, double crochet, chain 2, double crochet in the same place. Makes for a nice corner. As we work down the side of the raw edge of our square, so that's 18 rows of double crochet, we want to work 2 double crochet into the edge of each row. So that's the first one done. And we're going to work 1 more into the edge of that first row. You're working through the stitch. So here's the next row. You want to poke your hook right through the stitch and double crochet twice across the side of either a double crochet or a chain 2. So 2 double crochet per row edge. Work through the stitch, not around it. Working through the stitch allows you to anchor the stitch nice and firmly, and it also keeps any funny little gaps from showing up. So you want to make sure that you are getting at least 2 loops over the edge of your hook. Sometimes that might take a little bit of fiddling. 1 loop on the bottom, 2 loops over the top. And you hear me say this a lot, there's no real fine science to it. You just want to make sure you get 2 double crochets in per row edge. Now there's 8 double crochet rows in these patches, the big patches on either side of the middle. So that means you should have 16 double crochet down the side of each large patch and 4 double crochet across the middle. So if it helps you to count rather than to specifically work double crochets into the edge of each row, then you can look at it like that. So 8, 4, and 8. The other thing you want to do is just make sure that they're fairly evenly spaced. So you're trying to make this look as close to double crocheting in regular stitches all the way down the side. So just take your time. 2 double crochet per row edge all the way down. You'll still have 36 double crochet, and we're not counting the chain 2 turning, so just focus on those double crochet stitches for now. Across our second side, I've got 16 double crochet, 4 double crochet, and 16 double crochet, or 36 stitches all the way down. That's 2 double crochet worked into the edge of each row. Chain 2, third turning, and double crochet into the same place that you worked your last double crochet. And this is basically the same as the first side we did. 36 double crochet all the way across, and don't forget that right here in the middle you've got a chain 2 to work into the top of, so don't miss it. You'll have 36 stitches all the way across row number 3, or I should say side number 3. Side 3 of our square is 36 double crochet all the way across. You've got nice neat stitches to work into. Don't forget there's a chain 2 in the middle there, so one of those stitches has to be worked in there, and of course there's a chain 2 at the end of the other patch. That's where your 36th stitch is. Chain 2 to turn the corner. We're on our last side now, and it's exactly the same as the opposite side. You're working 2 double crochet per row edge all the way up your last side. So you can work double crochet, chain 2, double crochet into the last, or the same place, same stitch, same corner stitch. Finish off that row with another little double crochet, and double crochet, 2 stitches per row edge. Same thing, 36 stitches at the end of this side as well. Stitch number 36 of my last side is worked into the same place that I joined my yarn initially. I'm going to chain 2 just to turn the last corner, find the top of the chain 2 that I began the row with, and slip stitch in the top of it to join. And that is 144 stitches all the way around, and 4 chain 2 corner spaces. You can take a moment so to lay it flat, squeeze it and stretch it into shape. Looks pretty darn good. Looks like a square. And then you can fasten off and take a moment to weave in your tail. If you still have any other tails outstanding, make sure they all get woven in, and weave them into stitches that are the same color. So for example, my border is going to be woven back and forth underneath these stitches, and if after you've woven everything in, you have like a little tiny squeaky bit sticking out like I do right here at the corner, you can trim it, if it's especially if you've woven in quite a long tail. So trim it back and forth a couple times if you're using slipper yarn to make sure it doesn't want to come undone, and that is the offset square. And there you go, the offset square, the last and final patchwork design in our 2020 calendar blanket for the Patchwork Calendar Blanket. I loved making this so much this year. It was so much fun to play around with all the different designs you can get inside a square of approximately 12 inches. Also, it used the double crochet stitch, and it's a nice simple stitch, but you know what? You can really vary up the way something looks by changing the color and how the double crochet stitch works with other double crochet stitches. Anyway, if you haven't started stitching together your blanket, go ahead and do so. We did a live stream a little while ago about that. I've just whip stitched, which is a sewing method. I've just whip stitched my squares together. Nothing fancy, but of course you can join them any way you like. And we will very shortly be adding a border. We're going to have a little video for that, just like we do every year. And then our 2020 blanket will be all done, wrapped up and ready to give away if that's what you're doing with it. I'm keeping mine. So, we hope you enjoyed working on this blanket square along with us this week. We hope you enjoyed this project this year, and we will see you soon here on the Jayda InStitches show. Until then, stay safe, stay crafty, have a great week. Bye everybody.
Hi everybody, Mr. InStitches here. Thank you for watching today. Here are some of our other videos you might be interested in. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe.